Hey everyone, welcome back to round 10. Okay, so I'm going to be covering the game between Jan-Krzysztof Duda and Fabiano Caruana. Fabiano is just a little bit behind Nepo, I believe, by I think a point and a half, or I think it was a point before this game. So the game started with e4, e5, um, basically indicating that black is ready to go into a Spanish or a Petrov, or even a Berlin. So knight f3, knight c6, and now bishop c4. And this is the Italian game. Not Caruana. Duda avoids going into any sort of main theory with bishop e5. So he just sticks with the bishop c4 variation. Bishop c5, this is a well-known way to play. You basically put the bishop out here, you tuck it on a7, and at some point it might be useful on f2 if black ever generates an attack. So c3, very simple idea. White just wants to get in d4. Knight f6. Actually, d4 is a possible move here, but people don't really play it that much. So d3 is played instead. It's more solid, just holding onto the e-pawn. d6, very logical. Castles. And now a6 and a4, just preventing black from playing b5 and trying to play b4 himself. White wants to gain a nice space advantage here. Bishop a7, and now rook e1. White also wants to at some point play d4, but keep this e-pawn defended. So rook e1 makes sense. Other plans that white can play is like knight bd2, and then go knight f1, and then knight g3, and the knight can look at the f5 and the h5 squares. This is a very common, very basic idea in these kind of opening setups. So castles. Now h3, just to stop bishop g4 from being played. Here Caruana made a kind of an interesting decision. He decided to play bishop e6. Now, I think he decided to play this because he saw the game between Rapport and Duda, where Rapport had a similar setup but with colors reversed, and he managed to create an attack on the f-file using the g-pawn and the h-pawn. For those that don't know that game, you can check my channel, but I'm also going to briefly just take a look at this. So over here, you can see how black has a space advantage on the queen side, and white has a queen and rook and these double pawns on the e-file. Now if we go to this game, we could see a very similar idea happen after bishop e6 takes. If I flip the board for you after the move b4, it's almost identical. Black has the open f-file, but with these doubled e-pawns. The difference here is that this bishop is actually a little bit more useful. In the Rapport game, the bishop wasn't on a7, or a2 in that case. And what black tries to do is he's trying to utilize this bishop in combination with this open f-file to create issues on the f2 pawn. So let me just flip the board back. Okay, so knight h5, good move. Basically, he's trying to land on the f4 square, and that would allow black to develop with queen f6, rook a e8, maybe something simple like that. Maybe reroute the knight, and this knight on f4 is going to be quite an annoying piece. White just continues knight bd2, knight f4, and now knight f1. This is a very common maneuver just to get the knight on f1, to cover some squares, come to g3, come to h2 sometimes, even come to e3, although probably not right now. So queen f6. And now white decides to exchange off this knight. Probably not a bad decision. I think in the long run, if white leaves this knight alive, black will have time to play moves like queen g6, maybe even rook f6, rook f8, and he's going to have some sort of initiative. So I think this was it makes sense to do this as a decision. Just get rid of that knight, and queen takes. Now, why not pawn takes? Because of d4, and white has this huge space advantage. And it's really not clear how black is going to continue on the king side. This f-pawn does actually close off a lot of black's potential. So that wasn't played. Queen takes, queen b3. Now, in the other game, I don't think this move even existed. Basically, now e6 is under threat. And we'll see in the game how this e6 pawn is a constant weakness. So rook f6, just defending it for the moment. And now b5, just kicking back the knight. If this is taken, a very interesting trap, just rook a2, and the idea is to play rook a1, and there's no way to unpin. The rook cannot move, you'll drop the bishop, and basically white is just going to win material here. If instead of knight here, knight a5 is another move, and this can be taken, and the idea is that after bishop takes f2, black can recover some material, but actually because white has these two pieces for the rook and the rooks are not coordinating, white should be doing really well here. So that's not working. So black had to play knight a5, and now queen a2, just maintaining this pin, or not this pin, but this pressure on the e6 pawn. White has to tie down the e6 pawn to prevent black from just doing whatever he wants on the king side. So g5, and I think this is straight out of that rapport game. Maybe Caruana felt like maybe he was inspired in a way. I mean, if we just quickly go back, I mean, the same thematic ideas is here. The difference is the bishop is on g2, so it does provide this white king some extra protection. In this case, it's different because black's king is actually a bit more exposed. And as we could see in the rapport game, the e3 pawn isn't under direct fire from queen b6. And the king is already on h2. So it's like as if white bought himself more time here. In this game, it's very different because this e6 pawn is weak. And g5 comes, but the king is still pretty exposed. The bishop is on a7, which is very different. So yeah, it's just a very interesting little, I don't know if it's a coincidence. I really do think Caruana was inspired by the rapport game, which was against Duda, and I think and rapport won that game. So I think Caruana probably thought that maybe Duda just wasn't prepared to fight in these kind of positions. Who knows? So knight h2, just covering the g4 square. The knight really doesn't want to come to g3 because, well, you could just take this. This is a good example of how useful that bishop is. So he can't do that. So knight h2 is the next best try. And the reason he moved this knight in the first place is, first of all, of course, to cover the square. But this rook will be useful back on f1 to defend the f2 square from this bishop. So rook g6. Now, if, for example, a move like h5 was played instantly, white has this good move d4, basically blocking out this bishop. And white is going to play g3, and the queen will have to be expelled. So actually, right now, g3 is threatened. So that's why rook g6 or something like that has to be played to give the queen some room. g3 would just trap the queen. So in a way, this is preparing a very nasty queen trap. So that's why h5 can't be played immediately. Instead, rook g6, giving the queen some room anyways, and this rook might help push this pawn forward. h5 is still in the cards. It just can't happen right now. So d4 anyways, just blocking out this bishop from f2. White really doesn't want to invite something like queen g3, which would create this annoying pin. The king would have to move, and it's just not ideal. So h5 now, g3 anyways. But notice how the queen isn't really trapped. Queen f6. And now rook d1. And white has very nice development. The rooks are in the center. The pawns are also in the center. White has good control of the center. If black ever exchanges the c pawn just enters the game. And this bishop is still not active. This rook is also not active, and this knight is just, well, the famous chess quote, knights on the rim are dim. So this knight is very dim. It would really like to be on h6 or something, or h7, just so it can provide black some more support on the king side. So rook g7, and this was played to basically give the queen some room to move, but to also maybe prepare this rook coming into the game. And I'm not actually really even certain what rook g7 achieves. I mean, even rook f8 here just looks logical to me. Looks a bit more tidy than rook g7. But okay, so rook g7, king h1, just stepping out of this annoying g file. It's really vital that white does this. He also steps out of the way of the bishop, so that way he can take and there are no threats on f2. I'll show you examples in the future as to why king h1 was played here. So rook f8, again, black is just continuing, and you can probably see the bar. It says, like, to me it says +4, and it makes sense because white's defenses are so solid, black has no real way through. So for example, after d takes e5, d takes h4. And this is a really good way to play for white. Just going back for a little bit, if, for example, after rook g6 and d4, if after h5, g3, and here, if, for example, black tries anything with g4, this is just a disaster, because after all these captures, knight h4 is a good square, and this pawn is actually blocking off a lot of play on the g-file. And white could maybe consider taking, and this is defended. Rook f1 can come, rook e2 can come. Really not ideal. These knights are actually really good defenders, and this g4 pawn will prove to be a weakness maybe after queen e2 at some point. The rook is not in time to join the attack. So that's why black can't just push through and crush white. He has to play moves like this just to prepare things. But this is not working. h4 is an amazing move. Basically encouraging black to play g4, which looks really scary because it looks like after bishop f2, I'm sorry, that black just wins a pawn. But white here wins because of rook f1. And there's no way to step out of this pin. For example, if the queen just moves, you can just take this. It's a free bishop. So you can't step out of this pin, and white's threat is very simple. He's just going to play rook d2 and win this bishop, and there's nothing that can be done. So black can't actually take on f2. Now, that is the point of king h1, is because after it was preparing a move like h4 so that g4 could be met with knight g5, and bishop takes f2 wouldn't come with check. I thought that was actually really cool. So yeah, just really, like, this is the whole point of this move. So after takes, h takes, or g takes h4. Now, why not knight takes? This is also a very valid way to play. But after something like king h8, and I'll explain why that move is played. If, for example, black were to take on f2, white has this great move, rook f1, of course, pinning. And then after rook takes g3, it looks really scary for white. But this move, knight f5, exists in the position, hitting the rook, disconnecting from the bishop from the queen. And black has no way to defend this. He has to play rook g5. If for example, the knight was taken, I can't even be taken. Just realize there's a pin. But yeah, just a really nasty move, knight f5. And after rook g5, it's just an extremely uncomfortable position for black to play. Black cannot untangle from, like, he cannot save this bishop. This bishop, I think, could just be taken. And that's just a piece. So that's not working. So that's why after h takes, basically black had to take this pawn. He can't push forward because he can't take on f2. And if this is allowed, the knight just lands on g5 on this beautiful outpost. Sacking the exchange doesn't work because if this is taken, you just take on e6, and this is completely losing. So you can't sack the exchange here. This knight is beautifully placed, and white just has to play something like rook f1, maybe even knight f1 might be a try at some point. But yeah, I mean, this is defended by the queen, and if white can just coordinate his pieces, he should be fine, or winning actually. So g takes, g takes, and now bishop c5, and black really needs to get some pieces into the game. He cannot move this knight. It's completely trapped. It has nowhere to go. So he has to get this bishop into the game. It no longer serves a purpose attacking f2 because, one, the king isn't there. The other reason for this move, g takes h4, is because now white can just exchange these rooks, and black is out of an attack. He has nothing left. So something like bishop d6, and this was played just to cover rook d7, so rook d7 is not possible. It looks like a very strange maneuver to just put your bishop on a seemingly more passive square. But it also covers e5 and it stops rook d7, so it does serve a purpose. At this point in the game, I think Caruana felt like this bishop on a7 was doing nothing, so he had to move it. So knight g5 anyways. If this is exchanged, after something like king takes, knight g5, you know, black can still hold on here, and like white would actually rather have the rook on g1 here, just so he can have some more threats. The rook on d1 is kind of useless. So he just saves a move by not exchanging, and the rook is still on g1. Seems logical. Also, this rook will come to d3 and then switch over to g3 at some point. So it's good to keep the rooks in the game, because they can actually, if you keep both rooks in the game, white's attacking chances still exist. Now, taking here is not advisable because this can be taken. And after something like king h8, queen h6, if rook h7, you could just mate him. If king g8, then just, again, queen e6, king h8, and even something like rook df1, and I think white is just completely winning here. Black has no good defense to rook f1. Basically, knight f7 might come. The rook can be taken at some point. It's just looking really bad. I think if, like, for example, the queen moves to c5 and then just queen h6 now, and after something like knight e6, this is just completely crushing for white. White's pieces are just swarming this king. These rooks are not going to defend this king for long. So that's why he cannot take on f2, because e6 falls. So king h8, just avoiding, in a way, avoiding these checks. Now, white could just take here. White instead play queen e2, but I think taking here is completely fine. And I'm not sure what Duda really missed here. Maybe he looked at queen takes h4, and after taking on g7, maybe he saw rook takes f2 and thought, okay, this is not good, I have to give up my queen. But actually, you could just take this and play rook g1, and the threats on this black king are immense. Like, there's no way to actually avoid giving up material or getting mated. Like, for example, queen h4 here, you can just play rook g8, king h7, rook 1 to g7, king h6, and then you could play rook h8, and that's mate. The knight is defending the rook. So that is really like the problem here. And maybe Duda just missed this. The other variation maybe he looked at was after rook takes g1, maybe he looked at this and thought, okay, well, if I exchange here, then this is actually not a great way for white to go into this endgame, because now white's knight looks ridiculous because it can't get out. This knight is not attacking any targets, and black might play something like b6, knight b7, knight c5 to get this knight into the game. Or even actually just knight c4. I forgot that square is available. But yeah, so it's basically just not ideal. But maybe he missed here that instead of taking on f2, he could play this very calm move, queen d5. And I think it's hard to see that because it's like, okay, you do absolutely nothing, and black is kind of out of a move. Like, for instance, if something like queen f7, you could just take here first, and then you could play rook f1, and the knight perfectly supports this piece, and something is going to drop here. If something like queen g8, you could just take the rook, and that's it. And this is defended. So in this case, yes, white is winning because he's a rook up. So maybe that's just what he missed. Maybe that's why he thought, okay, well, I could just play queen e2, and at least I'm attacking h5. Seems reasonable. Queen g6 defends the h-pawn. And now rook d3, great move, just to bring the rook into the game via g3. The rook on d1 is doing nothing. This bishop is closing off this file. Takes. And now just rook g3. He didn't even bother taking back this pawn because it's not necessary. A takes b5. And now rook f6. Rook f6 to allow the queen to come to g8 and allow this rook to come to h6 if necessary, maybe come to g6, and also cover the e6 square. Just an overall versatile move. Now, black is losing here, obviously, because white has just such immense control over the g-file and the black king. And this pawn is an extreme weakness along with this one. But for white, I think his problem is that he needs to find a way to break through. And Duda came up with queen f1, which, if you saw the eval bar, went down. It gave away a +5 advantage in a way. But I think that this is still pretty strong for white. I just think queen f1 wasn't calculated through. Now the idea is actually pretty straightforward. White just wants to play queen g2, maybe knight f3, and just try to continue putting up the pressure like that. Maybe queen h3, just to look at the e6 pawn. But I think Duda didn't realize that black could just sit there and do nothing, and he'll be okay. So what black here played b6, and eval bar goes back up. It's hard to understand why b6 is such a bad move. The computers suggest instead of b6, knight b3, just to get the knight back into the game like this. And maybe at some point the knight may come to d2, and the knight will come to c5. And this is probably just a quicker way of bringing the knight back into the game. And maybe Caruana just underestimated just how valuable this move is. And he played here b6, which I think is just a mistake, because it doesn't really accomplish anything. Maybe he had queen a8 in mind, just to look over this pawn, maybe the king. But it's not good because this queen actually needs to stick around the king. And the e6 square is still pretty weak. So b6 is honestly just a waste of time. Like knight b3, knight c5 is more reasonable. Even if you played b6 to play knight b7, knight b3 is still a lot quicker. It's within one move. You don't have to waste a move with b6. So Duda just played queen g2. One thing is that this covers the diagonal, but it also just triples on the g-file. Now, I think here Duda probably realized that this tripling of the rooks and the queen is not really going to help him. Queen f8 was played, just to maybe pressure this pawn. And now queen h3. Now, this cannot be taken because of knight takes e6. The fork is pretty annoying. So the rook has to stick around on f6. Now just queen g8, just defending that square. And this is still a move. So rook 1 g2. I honestly thought maybe rook 3 g2 is better, just visually, because it gives the queen some more scope. Playing like this, I mean, white's pieces are really stepping on each other, and it's honestly very hard to maneuver. White is kind of stuck on h3, and the rooks just don't coordinate. I don't like this move, rook 1 g2. It looks a little bit suspicious to me. But anyways, knight b7, Caruana goes along with his plan. Maybe he had some idea of bringing the knight back this way. But, I mean, he went to c5 anyways. So knight h7 is a great tactic. Point is that, for example, if this, then you just take. And after taking, this is a winning endgame. Although white is basically fighting a rook and a bishop, the queen is very active and the king is exposed. The knight can come out, has a beautiful square on g5, and the queen can come out and start harassing the king. Should be a win. I'm sure Duda can convert this any day. So knight h7 was played. Rook g6 is basically the only move. Takes. Now knight g5, the knight comes back. You really don't want to exchange this, because after this exchange, if knight g5, for example, knight c5, and now this pawn is completely defended, and white's attack has just run out of juice. He really can't. There's no weakness in black's position. The bishop is holding c7 and e5 perfectly. These knights cannot apply more pressure to these pawns. And this queen is not active. It's just actually, I'd argue this queen is more active. This queen is also just on an odd square. This knight's on an odd square. And black is fine here. So you can't really rush to exchange things off. Instead, knight g5 had to be played to at least keep some pieces on the board. But again, like this whole plan of putting the three major pieces on the g-file, it really didn't pan out. I'm going to go back for a little bit just to discuss what he could have done instead. So in this position, after rook f6, Duda went with this idea with queen f1 to try to get in queen h3 or queen g2, just to pile up on the g-file or pressure e6. But actually, there's a very interesting move here, queen d3. It's very mysterious as to why this is so strong. But for one thing, it holds the pawn. That's one thing. The second thing, the knight cannot come here. If something like knight b3 is played, then knight takes e6 is a very strong move. Basically, if this is taken, then queen takes, and this cannot be taken because of queen g7 mate. So that's like one idea. The other idea is that if, for example, black, let's say, plays the same exact move, b6, Now knight takes e6 is again a very strong move, because after something like this, you could play again knight g5 and you just got rid of this pawn. It's a free pawn for nothing. And again, you cannot take this because of this, and this king is going to get shredded. That's not working. But yeah, queen d3 is a very interesting move. If, for example, something else, I'm trying to think of other moves here. Let's say queen f8, then c4, and this knight is still trapped. It's entirely trapped. If black plays something like b6, you can play here c5. What a move. If you play takes, then queen d2 is very annoying to meet. And the knight has to move. So let's say something like knight b7. And now this is again a very strong move. I think that was even possible without the insertion of queen d2, although I'm thinking queen d2 is played to avoid the c4 move. I'm curious why this is not possible here. It's interesting. I guess black he's defending everything. Queen f8 seems like a good defense for that. But then why is it working in this case? Is it queen h6 ideas? Like, for example, if takes, then, oh, okay, but f8's hanging, so. But yeah, I mean, okay, if takes, then you can just take this. That makes a lot of sense. I didn't actually even see that in my notes, but it's just very interesting to note that like queen d3 is like an engine move, but it's extremely strong. And it's actually kind of tricky to find because it's just a very calm move. So I don't blame him for playing queen f1. I just think that this whole plan just kind of fizzled out after a little bit. So instead of this, we got this position. And here, after rook f6, the move f4 was played. Now, why was rook f6 played? I think it was just to try to attack the f-pawn, to be honest. It does look a little bit strange to put the rook in the sights of the queen on purpose, but it's really hard to actually suggest an alternative here. So for, like, the king can't move. If this is played, then just knight takes e6 is very strong. And if, for example, I mean, there's also the real threat of queen f3, which will just threaten knight f7. So I think rook f6 was also played to cover queen f3. So f4 was played, and this is a really good move. Now I want to go look over all the captures. So the obvious thing is that if rook takes, then knight takes, and this is basically winning because the queen is hit and the rook is hit. There's no way to stop this. Something like this doesn't work because you just take this, and good game. So that's not working. Okay, what if e takes? This is a little trickier, but it's also winning. So e5, and now this move, hitting the bishop and hitting the queen. So let's say black plays rook g6. And the trick here is that after takes and all these exchanges, the idea is that after knight d6, you don't take on g8. Instead, you play queen e2, and I'll explain why. So if you take on g8, then you get this position. And basically, although it looks like white is just up material here, he has no way to break through black's defenses. So like, let's say king g7, the king comes up and he lands on this perfect square. And because this king is in this position, he's a little bit too late to try to pick up this pawn. So for example, after something like king g2, king f5, and that's it. Black has a very secure foundation here. If the knight were to retreat, this would fall. This knight cannot move because this knight needs to be defended. So it's just a fortress here. If we look at something else, for example, king g1, knight f5, and let's say after the knight moves from this square, you try to attack f4, e5. Really annoying move because now if this is taken, then knight takes h4, and black has very good drawing chances here. If anything, black can even try to push these pawns and trick white. So it's very dangerous to play like this. So yeah, that's why after this you play queen e2. I do want to note though, if queen takes queen, this is different because now the king is able to move up one square and he's able to come to f3 and pick up the f4 pawn. In the other case, when we took on g8, our king was still on h1. So he didn't have time to actually come here because king g7, king f6 was coming to take the knight away. But that's just a very, it's just a very small nuance there. Don't mind the cats. This is Pinky, by the way. We saw Nina the other day. This is Pinky. She's pretty cute. Anyways, back to the game. So after f4, okay, what if this isn't taken in any way? What if just bishop e7, stepping out of this idea with takes on e5? Then f5, and this is just an extremely uncomfortable position to play. If this is taken, then this is taken, and knight e6 is coming, and the g file looks extremely strong. This queen is supporting the pawn. The other knight can come into g5. Very uncomfortable for black to play. Okay, so after f4, knight c5, now it takes, and I think knight c5 just completely missed this tactic with knight f3 opening up the attack here. In this case, if rook g6, it's a little bit different because in the other variation, we took on f4, and after e5 takes knight f3, the pawn is still on f4 in that position. If you don't know what I'm talking about. Here, not here, my fault. Here. In this position, the same thing was played, but in this case, there's a pawn on f4. Over here, there is no pawn on f4, and that's a very big difference, because this pawn is actually not, it has no bearing on the position. In the other position, the f pawn was used as a way for black to have drawing resources. In this case, if the same idea is tried with rook g6, giving up this bishop and trying to get a fortress, this is different because there's no f pawn, and the king can easily march in and try to pick up the h pawn, and that's it, game over. So queen a8, attacking the e pawn. Knight takes e5. Knight takes, and I'm not sure what else there was really, like what else there is to do. The bishop has nowhere to go. If this is played, then this can just be taken, of course. So there's really nothing else. Black has no way of saving the bishop and the queen. So takes, and black is just down material here for nothing. Knight f3, very logical move. The king is actually completely safe. There are so many pieces around him, and there are no good checks. This is not really a threat. So for example, this, you could just play king h2 and the king is perfectly safe. So actually that is what was played. King h2, queen c1, knight d3. Just reorganizing the knights. And after this is taken, rook a2. What a move. Great move. The idea is that if this is taken, for example, then rook a8 is a very annoying move. And after king g7, queen g2 is just completely winning. If something like rook g6 to block this, then this can be taken and this fork comes and picks up the queen. Okay, so what about something else? Let's say king f7. This just leads to mate. Queen here, and I'll just go through mate very quickly. And this is game over. So that was actually all forced. Anything else in black gets mated quicker. So king f7 is not a good move there. So what about king h7? What if we go the other way? Then again, queen g8, and this is just a very powerful attack here. Black just loses his queen. So rook a2, really good move, trying to enter in on the a file. So knight f2 was played to hit the queen. The rook took this knight. Now if rook here, this is different because after something like queen g2, knight g4 is an annoying move, and black just wins this position because the knight's going to fall. The knight found a perfect square, and the king is actually safe, amazingly. So that's not working. So instead, Duda decided to take the knight on f2. Queen takes d3. Now queen g3, just entering again on the g file, cutting off the king. There will be no escape here. Queen d6. Queen takes. Pawn takes. King g3. Very good move. Just preparing to come to f4. If this king is checked, the king will just come forward. There's really no good way to stop this. It also just defends the rook, prepares to unpin. So rook f5, holding the h-pawn, attacking the b-pawn. Rook d2, the b-pawn was let go, but in exchange you get the d-pawn. If something like this was played, Then just rook e2, and that pawn is falling, and there's really no good way to hold it. Something like rook f6, knight g5, and again, you have no way of holding that e-pawn. You could try this, but it doesn't really work. The king gets there in time. So that's not working. Just to go back to this position here. The rook d2, the b pawn was taken, and this was taken. And in a lot of cases, actually, a knight and a rook versus a rook is a draw, but in this case, white has this extra pawn. If white didn't, then this is a draw. Actually, even black can try to play for a win. So king g7, rook takes e6. There's really no way to hold this. This rook is covered by the knight. So the pawn falls, and now the rook tries to cut off the king for the moment. Rook e5, attacking the h-pawn. King h6 holds it. Rook d5, good move. Just holding everything together, allowing the knight to come in here, or the knight to come in here. And at some point, when this knight activates, if the rook tries to check at some point, the king will just move up. The knight on d4 will also cover any of the b-pawn advances. When it comes to f5, it will be able to generate an attack on the king. And after, let's say, rook b1, which was what was played, knight d4, the knight again covers the square, but also comes to f5. Rook g1, king f4, and here Caruana resigned. Now, why? Okay, well, these checks don't really have anything to do with it. Basically, the white king just escapes, and after the knight joins the game, this becomes a very decisive attack for white. The king is cut off, and the knight and the king are very active. So there's actually a lot of mating threats here. For example, I'll just go through a couple of variations. Something like this is extremely strong. Black just gets mated here. For example, if king f8, then you just play rook b8 and that's mate. And if you go the other way, then knight f7, king h7 runs into check. So let's say king g8, rook b8, king here, and this is mate. So yeah, it's just a very annoying position. It's a lost endgame. There's nothing to do here. So that is why Caruana resigned. But a great game by Duda. What a comeback. Let's just briefly go over the game. So the opening was in Italian. And here it was interesting that Caruana chose to make the decision to play bishop e6. You don't have to play this way. A lot of people just played h6 just to prevent bishop g5. And you know, after bishop e6, I think what he had in mind was a similar position to what Duda had against Rapport, which he lost with this open f-file, and a very similar structure. But I think Duda handled this completely. Duda handled this well, and he completely not only equalized, but just managed to hold off Black's attack. And after all this, again, queen b3, very vital move. I'm pretty sure that this was from his Rapport game. He looked at it and probably realized that he should have started targeting that e-pawn sooner. b5, and you know, he just kept on putting up the pressure. Black had no attack here. Black could not generate anything. This bishop was cut off, the queen was kicked back, and white built up a very good defense here. The only slip that I think Duda even had was just this queen f1 plan right here, where he tried to get the queen on g2 or h3. I just think that this was maybe a little bit misguided. But again, it's hard to see why a move like queen d3 is so strong. So queen f1, and you know, basically Caruana just collapsed because Black has these permanent weaknesses, and this is a weakness. The knight is out of the game, and Duda just exploited this beautifully. He played very correctly, finding this move f4, and then Caruana simply blundering this tactic led to a win. So excellent game by Duda. The standings look like this right now. Nepo is still in the lead with 7 out of 10. There were actually a lot of decisive games today. Caruana is still on 5.5 out of 10. He had a loss today and a loss the day prior to yesterday. He is tied with Nakamura and Ding Liren. After them comes Rajabov, Duda, Rapport, and Firouzja. It looks like Nepo is going to win, but I'm really excited to see how Nakamura does. He beat Firouzja today, and I'm curious to see how Ding Liren finishes off the tournament as well. I believe he beat Rapport. So I'll see you in round 11. I hope you're enjoying the videos. Leave any comments or any suggestions in the comments section. Feel free to subscribe. I'm going to be covering round 11, 12, 13, and 14, and we'll conclude with that. So thank you so much. Have a good evening, good night, good week, whatever. Bye.